Zach Keenan here for DevilsDigest.com with me, publisher Hod Rabino, as ASU closes out the second week of spring ball, and we head into spring break now. So a 1 week hiatus really in between practices here, and now that we're in the midway point, it's a great time to break things down. So Hod, for starters, we saw Jaden Daniels throw some picks this week, and for a quarterback that's only thrown 2 career interceptions spanning his 1-year career in Tempe, does that raise concerns for you as well as on the offense as well?
Well, I mean, needless to say that if he's going to throw any picks, might as well do it right now in spring practice in February or March rather than between September and December. But I think that part of it is just really the learning curve of the Zach Hill offense. I think co-defensive coordinator Antonio Pierce a few minutes ago said it best. He says Zach Hill brought some funk to the building. Now, sure, sometimes that can confuse the defense, but sometimes I think it can maybe confuse the quarterbacks and confuse the wide receivers. The wide receivers in this system, and I know Zach Hill alluded to it earlier today when he addressed the media, is that these wide receivers have more freedom not to be so locked in their route and really make sure that they're reading a defense and adjust their route accordingly. And sometimes that can cause some kind of miscommunication between the quarterback and the wide receiver. And the other wide receiver is also throwing interceptions, so I don't want it just to dump it all on Jaden Daniels, so to speak. But I think that's really just part of the learning curve for the offense. And Jaden Daniels, I'm not saying is going through a horrible learning curve right now, but as far as having a not so clean spring practice compared to last year, yes, I think there's really no doubt about that. And it's just one of those processes that Jaden Daniels and the rest of the offense are really going to have to go through. But I think that we're seeing some definitely encouraging signs in the passing game. Brandon Pierce, who was last year a junior college transfer, we've been talking about him. It seems like ever since spring practice started, and I know Zach Hill mentioned him earlier today to mention that he's just really a fiery, speedy wide receiver, really adding an element that aside from Frank Darby, I don't think really exists in the wide receiving corps right now. So to have Brandon Pierce play the way he is right now, and give him a lot of credit because he was riding the bench hard in 2019 and really embracing that clean slate with a new offensive coordinator, a new position coach, and Prentice Gill, and really taking off and having a great spring. Ricky Parasol is another wide receiver that's really shining out there in practice seemingly every session. We're all talking about the 4 very accomplished wide receivers that are coming here as freshmen in the summer, and guys like Pierce and guys like Ricky Parasol really have to hold them off, if you will, really establish themselves significantly right now. So when fall camp starts, maybe there is some gap between them and the freshman wide receivers. Obviously, there's going to be competition, but it's how much equity you can build, so to speak, right now in spring practice to really establish yourself that much more in fall camp. And I think guys like Brandon Pierce, like Ricky Parasol, are doing a good job with that.
Yeah, and Zach Hill just mentioned moments ago how he would rather have Jaden Daniels throw those picks now than during the season, really, from September to December, wherever this team really goes. But on the other side of the ball, Hod, we're missing a couple key defensive players at the current moment. Could you run us through those and the impact that's been going on with Adam, as well as guys who have stepped up?
Yeah, first of all, linebacker Merle Robinson has unfortunately had a horrible tragedy where his dad passed away unexpectedly. It was just really even more heartbreaking that Merlin got to see his dad here in Tempe 2 days before he passed away in his home in Carson, California. So obviously Merlin Robinson has missed some time due to that tragedy. He and his family had services for his late father, and I think it's great that Herm Edwards, Antonio Pierce, a few players were able to attend the services too. So that really causes the linebacker group to shift right now. Darren Butler has some kind of undisclosed injury and wasn't able to run that much first team in the last few days as well. So guys like Jordan Backs, guys like Elijah Juarez need to step right now at linebacker. And it's really just more of an adjustment because you're talking about a defense that, as we mentioned earlier, is really challenged by such a creative offense. But when you have veteran players in place, maybe you can deal with everything that Zach Hill is throwing at this defense. But now when you have younger linebackers, that doesn't always work that smoothly. So that's one challenge that's happening. Another challenge in the secondary is safety Cam Phillips, who has been back home in Texas due to personal reasons for literally the entire spring practice. I don't think he really attended any session besides the very, very first one. And It's kind of unique situation because right now when their base is 4 defensive backs, Cam Phillips finds himself as the odd man out to begin with, and he was a starter last year. And you can only imagine how hard it is for somebody like him to come back into a situation like this when he comes back to practice with a new reality, if you will, with his defense. So, but that I think is just less of an issue because Ashari Croswell and Evan Fields, they're right now playing both safeties. Evan Fields playing more of a strong safety. Ashari free safety have been playing really, really well. Ashari Croswell, Jack Jones. When we talk about those interceptions that Jaden Daniels and the quarterbacks are throwing, those are really the 2 beneficiaries, if you will, of those turnovers right now. And I think when you have such a veteran secondary out there, maybe you should expect to have more turnovers, even if we have accomplished quarterback like Jaden Daniels throwing the ball. So those are some of the things that we've been noticing the first 2 weeks in practice. But really, I know the old football cliche says it all starts up front, and co-defensive coordinator Antonio Pierce said that Robert Rodriguez, the new defensive line coach that arrived here just about a month ago from the Minnesota Vikings, is the MVP of the spring practice. Now, I know you have some really objective realities that, if you recall, this time last year in spring practice, ASU, I think, had only 3 or 4 scholarship defensive linemen to practice. The numbers are much better this year, but I think also the teaching that Robert Rodriguez is able to implement in these players now that they have more depth and more talent than they had last year has really, really been beneficial for this defensive line. We talked so much about pass rush being an issue last year, and time will tell how much of improvement aspect it will be in 2020. But I think right now the early signs are more promising, and really this 4-man front at the defensive line is really, really helping. And you have a coach that is so entrenched in that system from his days in the Minnesota Vikings, and is able to teach them a little tricks of the trade, if you will, for them to confuse the offensive linemen out there. That has been a huge part of this improvement of the defense. Again, there's a lot of talent at linebacker, a lot of talent in the secondary, proven players left and right on the roster, but if this defensive line does not step up their game from 2019, it's still not going to be that much of an improved product on that side of the ball. And I think the early returns right now in the spring are showing you that this defensive line definitely has a great chance of taking that one step forward compared to their play in 2019, and that's going to be a really positive trickle effect for the rest of the defense if that does take place.
And that's really the gist for the first 2 weeks of practice. But now that we've finished these 2 weeks, all of a sudden there's a spring break gap, and it's different from last year's timing of spring football. So what happens now? Players break for a week, coaches get to spend time with their families, but how does that change? Because they've built 2 weeks of momentum now, and does it spoil it? Does it allow them to rest? What do you take on that, Hod?
Well, this coaching staff really wants to start spring practice as early as possible, and right now ASU has 2 weeks in the books. I think all 11 other teams in the Pac-12 are pretty darn close to it. Have started their spring practice this week too. So it's not so much of a contrast where Arizona State, if you remember, last year started the first week of February. By the end of February, I think maybe there was one other Pac-12 team that just started spring practice at that point. A lot of them started in March. The recruiting calendar dictates a lot because Arizona State, and they're not alone in the Pac-12 in that approach, really want to have as many unofficial recruiting visits during spring practice. That's why we're going to see after spring break a lot of Friday and Saturday night sessions, so folks can make it after school, folks can make it from out of state, and that's much easier that way. So Arizona State really had to construct the practice to have as minimal number of possible of sessions before the dead period ends. The dead period pretty much already ended, but now spring break starts. But you're going to see more and more recruiting visitors when spring practice resumes after spring break. And sure, it is a challenge where the players now have 8 days off, and how sharp they come back in that first session after spring break. I think every coach has just a little fear in their heart. So when we're back, observing them in practice, it's interesting to see are they able really to hit the ground running, or do they have that quote unquote spring break hangover still lingering? But another thing that was really comforting to hear, that we talked to Robert Rodriguez, the defensive line coach, and he said he was a little concerned about that getaway session, if you will, because I think right now as we look at our clocks, if the players are still here in Tempe, they're probably on their way to Sky Harbor Airwood, which luckily to them is just a 10-minute short drive to catch their flights to wherever they're going for spring break. But sometimes you have players just really tune out because it is that last practice before spring break, and at least from a defensive line perspective, Robert Rodriguez was very, very happy with what he saw from his unit. I know Antonio Pierce thought the practice was kind of rough overall for the defense. Do you blame it on spring break? Do you blame it on other factors? I mean, that's, I guess, open to interpretation. But, yeah, it's definitely a challenge for this team to practice hard right before spring break and to practice hard that first session after spring break. With the veteran team, especially on defense, you definitely would have higher expectations for that to take place. But that's really the rationale for that. I'm not a big fan of having that spring spring practice right in the middle, but there usually is a method to the madness. And in this case, again, the recruiting calendar really dictates that Arizona State have that spring break in the middle. So in the second part of the spring practices, they can really host as many recruits as possible, especially for those Friday and Saturday night evening sessions.
And, well, we're through 2 weeks in the books. So we've got a nice break right here. Players, coaches, and the media as well will take a quick break. But make sure to stay tuned, DevilsDigest.com, for practice reports as well as baseball and basketball news. And turn on tweet notifications for @DevilsDigest. Hod Rabino, Zach Keenan, have a great weekend.